Hello there. I'm Nicole and this is my channel, and today I want to talk about My Mother Makes. This is a little series I'm doing about things my mother made for us, and she died in 2000, and when I want to return home to her, I always try to find things that she used to cook for us. So today I'm going to show you how she made what she called poor man's meat, which is pot roast. So you use a chuck roast in this. And as I go through this recipe, I also want to just talk about something I found in my father's possession when he passed away. In my father's effects, I found my mother's yearbook. It's called the Redwood Log, and it's from a very, very small town in Northern California, and the town is named Miranda. And if we just go through her yearbook, we'll see some things in here. She signed it Jeannie Dixon. She was a senior class officer. And then you could see her picture is missing, but her name is there. And these are pictures of my mother that should have been in the yearbook. And I find that strange because where was she? She had the picture, so why wasn't she there? As a person who writes historical fiction and women's contemporary fiction, there's a lot of research that goes on doing that. And there's something we call primary documents. Primary documents are firsthand accounts of people that actually lived in a time. And if you were ever a little kid and your teacher was a good teacher and they had you sit in a circle, so you learned that, I forget, was it called round robin? But they would sit you in a circle, and then someone would say something to the person next to them, and then that would be repeated until it came all the way around, and whatever you said to someone came back, and it was nothing like what was said. And that's the problem with history, from third, fourth, fifth, sixth, 10th person that the story has gone through. It changes completely by the time it gets back to the original person who's the first-hand account. And that's why we call those things primary documents. They're the first-hand accounts. As a point of history, this particular yearbook did something really amazing as a primary document. What it did is it actually has what the person in the picture said they wanted their future to be, and then in a humorous way, what the entire senior class said they thought that person's future would be. And this is very important to me because in my mother's effects from her death, I found two cards that she kept. One was a business award, and the other was her card for Future Homemakers of America. And that and her Betty Crocker cookbook put into my mind a story. And the story basically was my mother began her life as a artist of home, and that was what she always wanted to do. All the things my mother carried with her was this diploma, and in that was this Future Homemakers of America card. But I lost that card, and my heart has been so heavy because it was one of the things that she carried around from place to place to place. I can't even tell you how much we moved and she moved in her life. And I now believe that actually that card needed to be lost because the story I was about to put out here, which is the problem with writing stories in history, is something always adds to it. Um, Her yearbook tells an entirely different story. So, as you can see, my mother actually wrote she wanted to be a social worker. And then her class said she would be the leader of the Salvation Army Band. Each person is just starting out their life, and this is how they saw their life going forward. This is what they wanted to be, what they wanted to do. So, if I would have told the story that my mother wanted to be an artist of home, as what she saw her future to be based on this card that got lost, I actually would not have been telling you the correct thing because my mother never told me that she actually wanted to be a social worker. I only found this in a yearbook that was in my father's possession in March. So my mother's entire history that I have in my head changed March of this year. So if we just flip through, there's some other things we find. She, of course, without any doubt, was in choir. She learned to play the guitar later in life and would actually go to our schools and play the guitar and sing songs with the classes. She would also direct the musical Christmas shows in our elementary school. She was the head of the folk mass at church as well as the children's choir. Here she is. And I actually knew this because when I was 12 years old, I came home from school and I told mom that the girl who usually played the bass drum in our band class was sick, so I got to play the bass drum in the band class. And I told her it was the hardest instrument I had ever even tried to play because you have to be able to set the rhythm of the music without listening to anything else around you. And if you listen to everybody around you, if you're not a strong bass drum player, you start going with them and they don't know what they're doing without you, so it all gets to be chaos. So that day in band class, it was all chaos because I had no idea how to do this instrument. And it turns out, in such a beautiful metaphorical way, my mother was the bass drummer, which is quite hilarious because my mother was like 5'3". This is the honors page. And this woman got an honor for the Betty Crocker Homemaker of Tomorrow Award. So Betty Crocker and the cookbook that Betty Crocker had was somehow equated with a distinction in a high school in the middle of the redwood forest of California in 1956. I have a very deep interest in that point. So there's the story of my mother's yearbook and my mother in the yearbook, but I want to go back because there's something else happening here. I want to really quick go back and actually look at it as a primary document of 1956 in rural California, in a tiny high school in Miranda, California, called South Fork High. There were exactly 58 graduating seniors in this class. And if we look at them, there are 39 girls and there were 19 boys. And as a point of primary documentation from 1956 in this rural spot in the middle of the big forest, these are the things the girls said they wanted to be when they got out of high school. And these are the things the boys said they wanted to be when they got out of high school. Only 25% of the girls said they wanted to be housewives. And unremarkable, none of the boys said they wanted to be husbands. So there's a story we have of the 1950s that all the girls and all the women living at that time who were, let's say, childbearing age, they wanted to be housewives. And on TV at that time, Leave It to Beaver's mother, she looked exactly like this picture. Because that was a story someone was telling. And they were telling it for a reason. And there's a history to that reason. But the reality was, public schools were growing and high schools were providing more types of classes and becoming institutions of knowledge and opportunities and social mobility. And girls wanted that in 1956. And we know that because this yearbook says it from their own mouths. Think about that. Because what we were seeing on TV in the 50s is our vision of what was happening to women. But that's not what was happening. High school was where women actually started to realize they could become more than just housewives, and 75% of them wanted something else. Which brings me to my mother. My mother wanted to be a social worker. So for me, it would be very interesting that 75% of these girls wanted to do something. Much of what they wanted to do, they had to go to college for, and it would be very interesting to figure out if any of them actually achieved that without the support to give them access to college. And my mother had some other vision of her life than being an artist of home. Which brings me to the fact she signed her yearbook Jeannie Dixon because her maiden name is Beebe. Her announcement of her graduation says Beebe, but her diploma says Dixon. Because my father, like these three young men coming out of South Fork in 56, went into service. They didn't call it going into the military. They called it going into the service. But more importantly, what happened was in 1955, the Eel River flooded in December. And my grandmother's house was washed away. So they had no house. My mother was probably sitting there trying to understand what was going on. There were complications at home with her stepfather. My grandmother really liked my father, And my father really, really wanted to marry my mother before he went to serve. So there was pressure on my mother. And so comes the point that I discovered in March of this year, 2024. My mother was married before she graduated, and she was only 17 years old. And her social work as an actual paid career for her drifted away with the dead cattle, the floating logs, and the destroyed bridges of the Eel River in December of 1955. But just so you know, the way my mother gave of herself and created of her home art, she actually was, as a mother and a home artist, a great social worker, and she was the leader of the Salvation Army Band in the sense of little children who followed her and her Pied Piper anywhere she'd go.